The year 1939 dawned with an ominous cloud over Poland. As tensions in Europe escalated, we Polish soldiers knew war was imminent, but none of us could have prepared for the ferocity and speed of the German blitzkrieg when it finally came on September 1st. The Luftwaffe roared overhead, dropping bombs that shattered our cities and scattered our defenses. The ground trembled beneath the relentless advance of German tanks and infantry. Wave after wave of enemy forces pushed deep into our territory, overwhelming our lines and pushing us back. As a young officer in the Polish army, I was stationed near the western border. I witnessed the chaos firsthand, the confusion, the fear, and the unyielding courage of our soldiers in the face of overwhelming odds. We fought valiantly, but our outdated equipment and limited resources were no match for the German war machine. The fall of Warsaw on September 28th was a devastating blow. The capital, once vibrant and proud, lay in ruins. 1940, the underground resistance. Following the surrender, many of us refused to accept defeat. We refused to submit to the brutal occupation of our homeland. Some joined the Polish government in exile in London, while others, like myself, chose to remain behind to continue the fight. Thus began the underground resistance movement, the Armia Krajowa, or Home Army. We operated in secret, hidden from the watchful eyes of the Gestapo and their collaborators. Our mission was clear: to undermine the German occupiers at every turn. Life in the underground was perilous. We moved in the shadows, conducting sabotage operations against German supply lines, factories, and infrastructure. We ambushed patrols, raided weapons caches, and gathered intelligence. Every mission carried the risk of capture, torture, or execution. But we were driven by a deep-seated determination to free our country from tyranny. In the winter of 1940, I narrowly escaped capture during a raid on a German ammunition depot. As gunfire echoed through the night, I slipped away into the cover of darkness, knowing that every mission brought us one step closer to liberation. 1941, the Eastern Front and new allies. In June 1941, Germany turned its sights eastward, launching Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The sudden shift in focus provided a temporary respite for us in Poland as German forces redeployed to the Eastern Front. It also presented an opportunity for us to strengthen our underground network and establish alliances with resistance movements in occupied territories. We received news of the atrocities committed by the Germans in the East: mass executions, the burning of villages, and the systematic extermination of Jewish communities. These reports fueled our determination to resist. We knew that our fight was not just for Poland, but for the freedom and dignity of all oppressed peoples. 1942 life in occupied Poland. Life under occupation was harsh and unpredictable. The Germans imposed draconian measures to suppress dissent, including curfews, forced labor, and severe reprisals against civilians suspected of aiding the resistance. Food and supplies were scarce, and many of our fellow countrymen suffered in silence. Despite the hardships, the underground resistance continued to grow. We established clandestine networks of safe houses, forged identity documents, and underground printing presses to disseminate anti-Nazi propaganda. The Polish people, united in their defiance, found ways to resist even in the face of overwhelming adversity. In the summer of 1942, I participated in a daring rescue mission to free captured resistance fighters from a Gestapo prison in Warsaw. Under the cover of darkness, we breached the prison walls, overpowering the guards and liberating our comrades. It was a risky operation, but the sight of their faces as they tasted freedom once more was worth every moment of fear and uncertainty. 1943, Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. In April 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto erupted in revolt. The Jewish inhabitants, facing deportation to extermination camps, rose up against their oppressors with whatever weapons they could muster. The Home Army provided support to the ghetto fighters, smuggling weapons and supplies through underground tunnels and sewers. The uprising, though ultimately crushed by the overwhelming firepower of the German forces, symbolized the indomitable spirit of resistance. It was a stark reminder that the fight for freedom and justice could not be extinguished, even in the face of unspeakable evil. 1944 Warsaw Uprising. In August 1944, the time had come to strike a decisive blow against the German occupiers. The Warsaw Uprising was a daring and audacious plan to liberate the capital city from Nazi control. Armed with limited weapons and supplies, we launched our assault, hoping that the advancing Soviet forces would come to our aid. For 63 days, Warsaw became a battleground, a maze of bombed-out buildings, barricaded streets, and fierce house-to-house fighting. We established makeshift hospitals, broadcasted underground radio broadcasts, and rallied civilians to join our cause. The German response was brutal and uncompromising. Luftwaffe bombers unleashed hellfire from above, reducing entire city blocks to rubble. Despite our heroic resistance, our pleas for assistance from the Soviet Red Army across the Vistula River went unanswered. Stalin, wary of the independent-minded Polish Home Army, halted their advance and left us to fight alone. As the weeks dragged on, our supplies dwindled and exhaustion set in. The Germans, enraged by our defiance, exacted a terrible vengeance on the city and its inhabitants. They rounded up civilians, executed resistance fighters on the spot, and systematically destroyed the city's cultural and historical treasures. On October 2nd, 1944, our leaders made the heartbreaking decision to surrender. The dream of a liberated Warsaw lay in ruins. Thousands of our comrades lay dead, and tens of thousands more were taken prisoner. The survivors faced deportation to concentration camps or forced labor in Germany. 1945 liberation and beyond. By early 1945, the tide of war had turned decisively against Germany. The Soviet Red Army, aided by Allied forces from the West, pushed the Germans back across Eastern Europe. On January 17, 1945, Soviet troops entered Warsaw, driving the remnants of the German garrison before them. The liberation of Warsaw brought a mixture of relief and sorrow. The city lay in ruins, its streets littered with debris and the stench of death. The scars of war would take years to heal, but for the first time in over 5 years, we were free from Nazi tyranny. However, the joy of liberation was tempered by the realization that Poland would once again fall under the shadow of a totalitarian regime, this time the Soviet Union. The Yalta Conference and the subsequent establishment of communist governments in Eastern Europe sealed our fate. Post-war years resistance continues. In the aftermath of World War II, the Polish people faced a new struggle for freedom. The communist regime, installed by the Soviets, imposed a reign of terror on our country. The Home Army and other resistance fighters who had bravely fought for Poland's independence now found themselves labeled as enemies of the state. Many of us went underground once more, forming new networks of resistance against communist oppression. We printed underground newspapers, organized protests, and carried out acts of sabotage against Soviet installations. The fight for freedom and democracy continued, albeit in a different form.